about 50% of all construction going on the African continent is being done by Chinese companies. That's pretty amazing. But, you know, there is this myth that the Chinese firms don't hire African workers, that they bring over Chinese laborers, and it is true, they do bring over Chinese laborers, but according to McKinsey, you know, which is highly reputable, about 89% of all the employees of these firms are indeed Africans. So they are hiring African workers. Now, this huge economic activity that I just outlined in the statistics there has given rise to both critics on the one hand and supporters on the other hand. People criticizing this heavy African investment by China, but people also supporting it, saying this is fantastic. So I'll try to outline as best I can both what the critics say and what the supporters say. Number one, the critics say it's creating in Africa a rising level of debt, and that this debt level for the African countries is actually unsustainable. Number two, they say there's a lack of transparency on a lot of these African projects, that these projects are being imposed on Africa by Beijing. They're being, these African countries must use Chinese companies to come in and do the work. And there's no transparency involving, you know, environmental standards, labor standards, et cetera. Unlike, say, the World Bank, which does a project, then projects are put out for tender for international bidding. Number three, they say a lot of these projects are not really useful. And some use the example of the Nairobi-Mombasa rail that now has cut the travel time down to about 4.5 hours. Some say that there's a perception among Africans that the goods that China produces, that manufactures and sells there, are actually below par. They're pretty shoddy products, that some Africans would rather actually buy the Western products, but they can't afford them, so they'll get the cheaper Chinese products. And the corollary to that criticism is that China is dumping below standard goods on Africa. And just a couple more criticisms you hear. The next one you'll hear sometimes is that China is trying to mainly just secure strategic friends around the world. And so they don't really care about Africa as real friends, but all they need are votes in the United Nations, for example, if they can convince the Africans to vote for China's interest as a bloc. And finally, of course, and this is one I've heard quite frequently, is that there are a lot of cultural differences and indeed even racism. And for example, they say that the Chinese don't mix with the Africans, that they stay in their own compounds, eat their own food, they don't mingle, etc., and that there have been instances of clashes between the Africans and the Chinese in Africa, and that is indeed true. Now, on the other hand, there are supporters of of Chinese and Africa's economic cooperation that can counter a lot of those points and bring up some other points. Number one, they say, Africa is the world's poorest continent and is in desperate need of infrastructure. And infrastructure lack of development has been one of the main things that's been hampering Africa's development all along. And by the way, a corollary to that, people add, is that the West has been neglecting Africa's infrastructure for decades. And so China is stepping into the void and doing some things. The World Bank and the IMF, they say, if you're going to talk about debt, they say, who are these organizations to question whether Africa is taking on too much debt? They weren't really asking that question when they were showering aid projects on people like Mobutu Sese Seko and then what was then called Zaire, now Congo, or giving money to Daniel Arap Moi in Kenya for projects that had to be repaid. So they're saying on the question of debt, the West should not be lecturing African countries about taking on too much debt, having loaded African countries with too much debt in the past. Number three point of the supporters, they say, look, Africa needs jobs. And as that McKinsey report that I cited said, those 10,000 firms employing Africans are now giving jobs to millions and millions of people all across the continent and in various countries. The next point is they say, look, Africa was, the next point to counter that idea that China is just looking for strategic friends, they say, okay, well, what's any different than that? Africa for a long time was a pawn during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. We propped up our dictators, the Soviets propped up their dictators. So what's the difference between Africa wanting to get friends on the continent? And, and I would add to that, look, no country is completely altruistic in the world. Every country does things because it's in their best interests. And then finally, to the charge that there are so many cultural differences and indeed lead to racism. Again, friends of Africa and supporters say, you in the West can talk about racism? at least Africans aren't being colonized by China, and they're not being sold as slaves. So, the West doesn't have a monopoly on lecturing Chinese about what to do in Africa. So it gets back to the original question. My original question: is China a partner, or is it an imperialist? Or, as young people now, you guys are on Facebook, I could say, is Africa a friend? Or is China a friend of Africa, or is China just a friend with benefits? And as you know from your Facebook pages, you can just say the answer is, it's complicated. The answer to the question of what China's intentions are in Africa really kind of depends, and here's, I believe, in your perceptions of China and your perceptions of China's rise and China's intentions in the world in general. If you are of the view that China is a benign power, and it's only now trying to reclaim its rightful place as a global power on the world stage, commensurate with the size of its population and its economy, then you might believe that China's intentions in Africa are indeed benign. And there are some historical facts to back that up. China is, a developing country that is aiming to help. And, again, historically, China has been involved in Africa for a long time. It's not new. During the 1960s, Mao Zedong supported the liberation movements in Africa, supported Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, supported SWAPO, supported Nelson Mandela, supported the independence movement in Zimbabwe. So, it's nothing new for China to be involved in Africa. Economically as well, China has been involved in Africa. In 1976, the Chinese completed the rail line between Tanzania and Zambia. And again, China has always been trying to present kind of an alternative model to Africa, and that's why a lot of the African liberation movements of old kind of modeled themselves after Mao. And so some people ask today whether that's still going on, whether China is trying to offer the African countries an alternative model of development, as the Western economic model looks like it's at least under challenge, I should say, both because of Brexit, the rise of populism in the West, and the election of Mr. Trump in Washington. That looks like the democratic system in some of the Western countries no longer works as well as we have boasted in the past. Concern about China's role and intentions in Africa, I submit to you all here, has grown in direct proportion to the deterioration in China's relations with the United States. That is to say, as the United States has shifted its view and come to see China not as a partner or even a competitor, but more as a strategic rival and a threat, so have the suspicions grown that China's intentions anywhere in the world, whether it be Southeast Asia or particularly in Africa, it must be something pernicious, dangerous, and not something benign.